everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of Astronomy at Home with Bill Burnyeat. My name is Chris Miller. I'm a librarian at Coquitlam Public Library. And I want to welcome Bill, who's an astronomer, who's been active with helping us at the library by running programs before with his mobile planetarium and joining us for special events from time to time. So we're always thrilled to have Bill join us. We've got a general topic for today, which is we want to talk about constellations. And so I am going to launch into the interview. We expect that it'll take about 20-25 minutes. First question for you, Bill. What constellations do you look for on clear nights at this time of year?
Well, Chris, I guess the main ones at this time of year are the summer triangle constellations. So they form the bright star Vega, and then Altair and Deneb. And this trio makes a big triangle up in the sky. Vega is extremely bright, and Deneb is quite high up, and Altair is bright as well. And Altair has a star above it and below it to make a little trio. So those three come to the middle of the sky in June, July, August, and are still there in September. So the summer triangle and that area is of interest because of the fact that the Milky Way runs right through there. So it's a very rich area in sky stars and deep sky objects because the Milky Way is right there. And it's been noted for a long time, and it's the subject of many myths in Greek and Roman mythology. Vega was the harp, or like a musical instrument, called a lyre, and the Cygnus is a swan flying down the Milky Way, and Altair, the eagle, is flying up the Milky Way. But in other cultures, they had different takes on this. So in China, the bright star Vega was called She Nu, and she was a weaver maid. So she had the job of sewing stars onto the sky. She had a needle and thread and a loom. So she did this scientifically, right? Putting all the stars up in the sky. And she did that because the emperor told her to do that. Now, he lives, apparently, in the Big Dipper. In the bowl of the Big Dipper is the house where the emperor of China lived. He had two houses, one in Beijing and the other one in the Big Dipper. So he told her what to do. Get going and make more stars. But one day, She Nu went on a holiday, and she met the star Altair, which is the ox herder. So he's an oxen herder, and the little stars around him are oxen, and they decided to get married. But she had to ask the permission of the emperor for this, and he said no. Well, she decided to get married anyway. So the emperor sent birds to tell her to get back to work. But the birds were ignored by She Nu because she didn't want to do what a bird told her to do, which would be foolish. So the emperor heard about this and got even more angry and decided to make a silver river run through the sky. This silver river is what we call the Milky Way. But apparently, he put it up in the sky, and because She Nu's on one side and the ox herder on the other side, they cannot communicate. They're separated by this silver river, which has no bridge on it. So She Nu and her husband cannot meet unless once a year the emperor relents. And in July, where they have the festival in the Far East of She Nu, it's said that she gets on the back of one of those magical birds and flies across the Milky Way to meet her husband. Now, if the trip doesn't happen for some reason, it rains. And the rain is called the tears of She Nu because she's sobbing because she can't make her appointment. So that's an example of a star myth. It's a fairy tale or a fable or some such thing as that which involves the stars. And every culture has had these. Most star myths we'll never know anything about because they were produced by non-literate people. So there must be like literally millions of these things that we have no idea of. But many of them have been retained. The Greeks and Romans, because they published, have some of these star myths at hand, and we can find out what they were. Also, other literate cultures, such as the one I mentioned in China, there was literacy, Egypt, and other places too. So these tales have survived. And another way to make them come alive again is by the work of people called anthropologists who travel around the world and visit places, and they often record traditional tales, and these tales often involve the stars. So the great scholars like Franz Boas or Claude Strauss, they recorded many star myths from the people that they visited on their explorations of pre-modern cultures.
Now, you mentioned particular stars as part of the summer constellations, and you mentioned ones like Altair and Vega. Where do you find those in the sky? If there's an amateur astronomer who's got a pair of binoculars or a small telescope, in which direction will he look to try to locate those objects?
Well, the best way to find them is to go out in the evening, in the late spring or summer, and simply stand looking towards the south. Now, when you're doing that, you'll notice over your left shoulder, high up in the east, is one of these bright stars. It's Vega. And then Deneb, if you turn your head towards the north, is up there. And then Altair is far to the south. So the three of them make a recognizable triangle. Right? And the Milky Way is immersed in this triangle, just as we heard in the story. It cuts off one from the other star by being in the middle of them. So those three bright stars are visible without any optical aid. But if you take a pair of binoculars and you look along the middle of the area, in the middle of the triangle, you'll find more stars there than if you look elsewhere. And that's because of the presence of the Milky Way, where the stars are scattered much more liberally than in other places.
Now, you've mentioned those constellations in particular. Are there other seasonal constellations that are best viewed during this time, which is, as you say, kind of late spring, maybe verging into the beginning of summer?
Well, down in the west, there'll be the star, a bright star in Bootes, the star Arcturus. And Arcturus can be found by following the Big Dipper. So the Big Dipper in this time of year stands up high with the bowl upright, and the handle of the bowl points towards the ground. And Altair is Arcturus is at the end of that handle's pointing. So if you follow the handle, it's arced and it curves, it'll point to the ground, and at the end of there, the star Arcturus pops up over the eastern horizon. It's a kind of an orange star, and its color is easily seen in a pair of binoculars. So because it's orange, it has a cooler surface temperature than the sun, which is whiter hot. So orange stars are cooler, and bluer stars like Vega or Altair are hotter. Yeah.
And does Arcturus, now that forms part of a constellation as well?
It's in the constellation Bootes, which looks like a big kite. It's kind of difficult to make out. To do a lot of this, it's helpful to have a planisphere, which is a disk which shows the stars on it. And I have one right here, and I'll just hold it up like that. Now, this is on a turntable. So there are two pieces of paper or laminate, and they turn against one another. Now the days of the hours of the evening are on the outer surface here, and the days of the year on the inner blue part. So I turn them to match the day and the hour that I'm at. So if it's June 1st at 11 o'clock, I turn this until I see June 1st, 11 o'clock matching each other. Then I take the thing outside and hold it up with the south facing to the south, right? And then I have a representation of the sky with the constellations on it. So the white dots you see are the stars, including the summer triangle. They're on here as well. And the Milky Way is represented by a series of little dots. So this is the place to find the constellations. Once you get used to using a planisphere outdoors, it becomes second nature. And then after a while, you'll find you don't need the planisphere at all. You can take it away because you'll know exactly what those stars are, learn their identities, and you'll know them just as familiarly as you would the houses on the street where you live. So then you won't have any difficulty finding them. For more detail in a constellation, for example, the bright star Vega, if you look closely, you'll see there's a little box of stars around it. It makes a little square. And those stars are interesting themselves. One of them is kind of orange. The two bottom of the stars in that are the home of M57, the Ring Nebula. So telescopes in there show kind of a cloudy round ball with a hole in the middle. Looks like a ring or a donut. And the star at the top near to Vega in binoculars is a double star. And then if you look with a telescope, each one of the stars in the double star is itself double. So there's two pairs or four stars in total. There's 2 and 2. And depending on how powerful your instruments are, you can see 2 or 4 or just 1 if you're just using the eye. So there's lots of things to be seen, even in a small area of sky. In the middle of the summer triangle are little constellations like Sagittarius the Arrow, which looks like an arrow, or Dolphin, the dolphin, Delphimus the dolphin. So the dolphin looks like a squished box with a little tail on the end. It's supposed to be the dolphin. And it's involved in an ancient myth about Arion, who played the musical instrument, the flute. So he's a flute player, apparently the very best flute player around. But he had a terrible mishap. What happened was he went on a voyage and he didn't know that the people on board were pirates. So he was in big trouble. They took away his flute and all his gold and jewels and threw him into the ocean. But he didn't drown because a dolphin came and rescued him. So he rode on the back of the dolphin and escaped. He went back to Athens, where he informed the police of the time that these pirates were on the seas. And when the pirates came in, there was king's representatives were there, and they asked him, well, where is Arion? And of course, the pirates were embarrassed, didn't know what to say. And then Arion jumped out from behind a bush, showing himself that he wasn't drowned and that they were in big trouble. So there's a star myth from Greece, and it's the dolphin, it said, was placed in the sky to commemorate the story. So for every constellation, there's a story. It's sort of like, you might say, the constellations are kind of like a comic book, right, up in the sky. So comic books have pictures, but there's text to go with the pictures or a story. It's the same with the constellation. And of course, this is interesting and that, but you might ask, well, what's the purpose of this? The original purpose of these stories seems to have been a mnemonic, in other words, a memory system. So because there were no text when the constellations were invented, they were that old, people began to learn the constellations by the stories that involved them. And that way they could keep them in their mind in the absence of text. And we know that in Polynesia, navigators who were non-literate had ways of understanding and remembering where the stars were. What they did was memorize locations of stars where if you were at a different island, they'd be slightly different in their position than you were at home. And so they used that to navigate from one island to the other over long distances without any written system at all, but simply a memory system, because the stars had these meaningful arrays, making squares, triangles, or rectangles out of them, and then having a person or an object or something like that that was recognizable and that everyone agreed on. That is really what a constellation is. So a constellation is kind of an odd thing. It's not really a thing in nature like a flower or a mountain. It's not that. It's made by us. At the same time, it's made out of things pre-existing, right? So it's sort of in a nebulous area in between a work of art and a work of nature. It's kind of in the middle.
It's sort of an aspect of pattern recognition, I guess, that's connected with this idea of constellations.
Yes.
And one thing that struck me in the little bit of reading that I did was how certain of the objects in the night sky, certain of the constellations appear to have passed. In some of them, I'm sure that there are different stories in different cultures and with different peoples, but some of them seem to have a great deal of continuity. Where I read that a constellation that was, I think it was Leo, was believed to have been discovered by the ancient Babylonians, but then it got passed down through time and the Greeks adopted it also as Leo the lion, but they put their own cultural spin on what the lion meant. They had their own mythological tale related to Hercules, I think, or Heracles in the case, would be correct for the Greek. So
that's right. The lion in Greek is the Nemean lion, and the story goes that the lion preyed on people indiscriminately and ate them all up. So the villagers got together and asked Hercules to come and help them. And so he did, battling the lion in its den. And then its hide was put up in the sky as a constellation. So, but you're right, it was recognized as a lion before the story in the Middle East in a very ancient times.
Why are so many of the constellations, as we know them today, associated with particular Greek traditions and legends?
Well, it's the Chinese had 300 different constellations, and there were different constellations in other places as well. But the reason that they were Greek and Roman constellations became the norm was simply they were published in a book by Claudius Ptolemy. So he was a Greek astronomer, and he wrote a book called the Almagest. And the Almagest has 48 other constellations, the core constellations in it. So he not only names the constellations, but has a way of specifying where they were in the sky, which is like latitude and longitude, right? So in fact, he invented that as well. So he had a sky and an earth, latitude and longitude. Every star had its location, which he specified. So because they covered the whole sky and was a complete system, other astronomers could use it without any fear that there was a place in the sky that wasn't assigned to some constellation. So the completeness and the fact that this was published gave the Greek astronomers the edge in this. And then with the advent of the Renaissance, Greek and Roman studies became very important, and they were the heart of curriculum in schools as late as the late 1800s. So, in fact, many people can remember taking Latin in class, even today in school. I took Latin. So, because of the emphasis on Greek and Roman letters and the literature that came from that period, along with other things such as the plays of the Greek playwrights and the poets and things like that. Along with that came the astronomy as well, the astronomy of Ptolemy. And so the constellations were part of that group. Now, you might think, well, isn't that really old in that? No, we have new ideas about these things and that, like the Big Bang and things that the Hubble Space Telescope or traveling to the ISS. I mean, those are things that couldn't have been done then. It's true, but it doesn't really matter. The constellations are arbitrary and are just a system of making a map out of the sky. So it doesn't really get obsolete like ideas about physics might get obsolete or replaced, or our ideas about stars and clusters might go through modifications and changes with new knowledge. But the constellations aren't like that. They're like the borders of countries. The borders of countries don't become obsolete because we learn more about geology, do they? I mean, we just accept them. So it's the same with the constellations. You can think of them as the countries up in the sky, just as the countries on the earth cover up the earth.
Now, we're familiar with at least some of the common constellations where we are up in the Northern Hemisphere. I was curious, because we never get to see them, what are some of the notable constellations in the Southern Hemisphere, and what sorts of things were they named for?
Well, from Greece, only a certain amount of the sky could be visible because the sky is like a bowl, and so the bottom part of that bowl is hidden from us, so we can't see part of it from Canada at any time. So what happened was, during the age of discovery, the exploration with sailing ships and explorers, people began to go into the southern part of the world, go to places like South Africa or southern part of South America or Australia or New Zealand, and the stars there were different. So the same methods were used, though, to cover up the incomplete ness of the sky. So new constellations were made and their boundaries delineated, and the stars in them counted and given names. So they were given names often with in mind things that were current in that time. So the air pump, which was a technical innovation, that became a constellation. The telescope, and things like that. So new devices that were new to science in the 1700s became the names for constellations. And some of them, such as the ship Argo, was also added, and another one, the Southern Cross, because four stars in the sky resembled a cross. They were named as the Cross constellation. So it's the smallest constellation in area, and it's one that never rises from any part of Canada, right? So you'd have to travel at least, if you were in Cuba or south of that, you probably would be able to see it low in the sky. But generally, it is on hand if you were in Australia, New Zealand, or someplace that's quite close to the southern pole.
Now, I wanted to dial things back a little bit. We had talked about Leo briefly before, about its sort of continuity as a lion figure in the sky to different peoples. And I've got an image that I want to share, which is just to kind of reinforce the idea that there are interesting objects that you can locate in the sky that are within the constellations. And so I'm going to do a little share screen thing here, and I'm going to go like that and that. Now, what we're looking at, I think, is something called Messier 96. And I'm gonna turn that over to, I think I've got that right. Yeah, pretty sure I got that right. And that is
Okay.
is something that's inside Leo. So
in the lion, that's right.
Yeah. Bill, what can you tell us about this object? Obviously, it won't appear this way if you just have, if you have binoculars or a small telescope or anything like that. But obviously, blown up huge, it's a spectacular object. What are we looking at?
Well, this is a spiral galaxy, not too dissimilar from what our own galaxy would look like if we could somehow step outside of it and look at it from the outside. So it's a large galaxy. Now, in binoculars or a little telescope, this looks like a faint whitish smudge in the sky. It doesn't look like this because this is taken by a telescope with a 2-meter mirror, so a big telescope. And so it looks like a kind of a foggy patch. But if we look at this picture, we see it's kind of interesting. When stars begin to blossom out, the brightest stars are bluish, right? And so you can see around the edge of it, there's kind of a blue halo. And in that blue halo, there are pink blobs. The pink blobs are where the stars are formed. So stars are formed into pink blobs, and then they shine out brightly, and the brightest of them are the blue stars. So that's how the outer part of it, it shows itself. Now, in the middle, you don't see that. There are no pink blobs or blue areas in the very center of the galaxy. It's sort of yellowish, and that's where older stars are. So, in other words, the architecture of the galaxy, we can learn something about it. The older stars are in the center, and the younger stars are on the edge of it, around the blue area, with the pink area. So they're like nurseries for stars, whereas the center is for the mature and older stars. So our galaxy is like this as well. And we live on the edge of our galaxy. So therefore, we're in an area, if we could see it from the outside, which would see lots of blue stars and pink objects around it as well. So we live in a relatively youngish area of our galaxy. So the solar system that is only half as old as the age of the entire galaxy. And in the middle of the galaxy, there are many, many older stars than the sun is. So in other words, the picture shows quite a lot of information, but you can't tell that just by a casual look. Through a small telescope, you'll just see an ellipse of white, pale white, like a tiny cloud that has a form to it, is not diffuse.
And in what part of the sky can we locate Leo, Bill? Where would we look for that?
Well, Leo is on hand right now. As soon as it gets dark, Leo is in the southern part of the sky. And then it's moving towards the west. So it's really a spring constellation, and we're moving into the summer. So the time to catch Leo is right now. It has a bright star, which is the forepaw of the lion, and that is the star Regulus. Regulus, it comes from the Latin rex, regis, which is king, right? So Rex is king. I still remember my Latin, how to decline that. Rex, regis, regis, and so on. So it's a king star, it's often called. So that's a bright star, one of the brightest 20 stars in the sky. So that one is easily seen. And then if you look around it, you'll see there's kind of a rectangle next to it with a triangle on the end. So it looks kind of like a tube of toothpaste, which is long and like a rectangle, and then it has a point at the end where the toothpaste comes out. Well, that's kind of what the constellation looks like. Yeah.
And I'm going to just click a button to stop the share. So the beautiful galaxy is going to disappear, and we're back into the main room again. The only other thing, and thank you, NASA supplies the images. So anyway, I make a point of going to visit their database to see if there's images that might correspond to the things that we're talking about. So that was just one that I found. Okay. NASA gives permission for any sort of nonprofit usage. But thank you, NASA, for taking wonderful, beautiful pictures. And the only other thing I was going to share really quickly, I think, because I think we're dialing down towards the end of the interview, I wanted to just quickly go to, I might have to go over here first, just a site that I found that has, it's a guide that you might be able to go to and also learn more about the night sky. And so I'm going to see if I can go. Where do I have it? There we go. I'm going to share that. It's just it's just a site called Constellation Guide. And there may be many more like it, but it's got a big list of constellations, and you can find them by name. You can look and see, there's a section, I think, that's about seasonal constellations. You can read about constellations of the spring and summer. And then it'll tell you some details, not quite in the detail that Bill shared today, but there's background about some of the stars and the stories about the stars as well. So Constellation Guide, and I just thought I'd bring that up, constellation-guide.com, and I'll stop the share for that. And without further ado, I think we've reached about the end of our interview time for today. I wanted to thank Bill again for joining us for this episode of Astronomy at Home. And we look forward to speaking with you again next week. We'll figure out something to talk about between now and then, and then we'll meet again. And the interview should go up at the same time. So thank you for joining us today, everyone. And we hope that you tune in again to see our next interview. And take care, Bill.
Okay, thank you.